When you start a new business, picking a name can be an agonizing process. It actually kind of always is an agonizing process because it's so final. Changing the name of your company is a huge deal. And if you get your company name right, you make it easy for people to remember your name and to spread the word about your business. But if you get it wrong, folks will struggle to find you. They'll struggle to understand what you do, and they'll struggle to remember your name so they can tell other people about it. Your company name communicates so much about your company that, if at all possible, you really want to get it right the first time. So in this video, I'm going to guide you through selecting a memorable business name, and I'm going to highlight common naming mistakes that you should steer clear of at all costs. And if you stick around till the end, I'm going to walk you through the exact process that a company I invested in used to find their domain name. And this is the process I would use today if I were looking for a new company name. I want to start with a disclaimer. The reality is that there are plenty of poorly named products out there that still succeed. So you can make a bad name work, but it's like running against a headwind, right? You don't want to start your business in hard mode. A couple examples that I can think of are eBay, with that capital B in the middle of the word, Xerox, with two X's and they're pronounced differently. One pronounced like a Z, one pronounced like an X. Microsoft, it's just very not descriptive. It was software for microcomputers. You know, Bill Gates and Paul Allen's previous company was called Traf-O Data with two dashes in it. So that one didn't succeed, but it shows you how good they are at naming companies. Even Google, I would say, is not a great name. It's a misspelling of a large number. It's supposed to be spelled Googol, and they misspelled it and put GLE. And frankly, it doesn't describe much about the company or what it is. And these days, I guess we use it as a verb, but that's only because it's the best search engine out there. And they definitely could have come up with a better name in the early days. So why does a good name matter? I mentioned it a little bit in the introduction, but even though a good business can survive with a bad name, you don't want to build your business on hard mode. A memorable name will absolutely help you. A bad name is unlikely to kill you, but again, it's running upstream, so to speak. Memorable names make it easier for word of mouth to happen, right? Your name is part of your brand. People tend to trust a good name and to maybe look at eBay with a bit of a side eye. I remember the first time I used eBay, I was like, what is this website with the bad design that has a pig Latin name? And honestly, it made me just not trust the site because it felt like it wasn't a legitimate business. And so as you're looking for a name, usually it's a process of elimination, right? It's often best done as brainstorming and then eliminating the things that don't fit and just slowly brainstorming 20, 30, 40, 50 names. And these days you can do that with ChatGPT, right? Do it pretty easily. And then just narrowing down to your top 3, 5, or 10 and starting to ask for outside feedback. Now, one question you might have is, do you start with the domain or with the brand name, right? Your URL or your brand name. I start with the brand name. I want to come up with the best brand name possible, best company name, best product name, best book title. And then if I need to go buy a domain name, I will. If I can register it for $8, great. I'm going to show you some hacks later in this video of how I think about adding prefixes or suffixes or going with not .coms in case the .com is just too expensive. So now I'm going to dive into 5 mistakes that you should avoid when coming up with a name. The first mistake is that your name lacks clarity. And so there's something called the crowded bar test, which is if you're in a crowded bar, probably noisy, probably distracting, and a friend were to tell you the name of a product or company, can you hear it, understand it, and remember it? So one example of this is if I were yelling over a bunch of people in a bar and I said, I wrote a book, it's called the SaaS Playbook. It's a playbook for SaaS companies. The odds are you're going to hear it, you're going to understand it, and you're going to remember it. But if I were to tell you that I have a podcast called Startups for the Rest of Us, which is kind of a long, tricky name, I think that's a fail, you know? And frankly, we named the podcast 14 years ago. It was before I knew a lot about naming. So I think Startups for the Rest of Us, if I could go back, I would rename it. It's too long. Like just type the domain name, type startupsfortherestofus.com. Every time I say it, it's a tongue twister. It's not the best name. It doesn't mean that we haven't succeeded, right? It doesn't mean that I haven't built a great show, but I think the name does count against it. Another example of an unclear name comes from Matt Paulson. He's a longtime MicroConf attendee, and at his first MicroConf, he had a website he called Analyst Ratings Network. And he kept saying it to people and no one had any idea what he was saying. So he quickly went out after MicroConf and bought a different domain name. And if I recall, he paid a few $1,000s for it, marketbeat.com. It's a great domain name, and he's built this into a $10,000,000 bootstrapped ARR business. Thing to remember is if you get too clever, names are hard to describe or remember. If you've ever seen that movie, That Thing You Do, the band's name is The Wonders, and we can all think of how that is spelled. They started with the ONEDERS, and people call them the Oneaters. And they're trying to be clever. They're trying to have a pun, wonders, but it doesn't work. Mistake number 2 is having a name that is either too generic, too common, or it's too close to your competition. So there's no differentiation. So if you watched the American version of The Office, there is an episode where they have Alfredo's Pizza and Pizza by Alfredo, and there's a bunch of confusion between these two names. And so realize if you're going to name your company something generic, like website search engine optimization.com, while that's an interesting exact match domain name, that's not a brand. That's just a description of what you do. So something to consider. It's not a hard and fast rule, but I like to have names that are unique enough so that you can own the search box on Google, right? So this is the case for fictional made up names. I mean, think of like Tiny Seed and MicroConf, right? Those kind of they give you an idea or a feel for what they are. But if you search for those names, we ranked for them from day one, right? We didn't have to go beat out other more generic sites. Like imagine when Slack and Stripe first got started. Now those are actually really good names, but they had venture money behind them. But if you searched for Slack 10 years ago in Google, you probably wouldn't have come up with the company. And same with Stripe, you would have gotten a noun, a Webster's definition page or something like that. And so being just a little clever and having either compound words like Laura Roeder did with Paperbell, she got paperbell.com. And if you Google Paperbell or search that anywhere, you're going to come up with her company. And Craig Hewitt as well. He's a Tiny Seed founder. He has Castos.com. And Castos is, of course, something he owns in the search results. The third mistake I see are misspellings. I'm not sure if you watch She-Hulk, but there's a character named Madison, and her tagline is, "My name is Madison with 2 N's and 1 Y, but it's not where you think." And it's just this super confusing thing. Now, that's not a brand name or a product name, but you get the idea is the further you misspell something, you have to explain that every time you say it out loud. So imagine you were getting clever with your URL shortener, earlybird.com, URLY. Producer Ron came up with that. It's terrible, but it's a good example. Like it's clever. It's a URL, but earlybird, except it's spelled URLY, and everyone's going to say, why? Examples of this of companies that are big and successful, but have misspelled names, and I think are probably to their detriment, is Lyft with a Y, Flickr with no E, Tumblr with no E, and Fiverr with an extra R at the end. Something to think about is watch out for Google autocorrect, right? So when you type your potential name into a Google search bar, do the results get autocorrected? And consider that every customer searching for your brand may suffer the same doubt. So I would much prefer a compound name of 2 things like Tiny Seed and MicroConf than having a misspelling. Because if I mention Tiny Seed on the podcast, I don't have to tell you it's spelled S-E-A-D or S-E-I-D because we were getting really clever. It just gets annoying and people forget it. The fourth mistake I see people making is having a brand name that is difficult to pronounce. This is similar with misspellings. If someone can't read it and pronounce it, there will be confusion, or everyone pronounces it 2 different ways. Like I've always thought, the Moleskine, Moleskin notebooks? I mean, we all use them and Hemingway used them and all this, but I think that's a bad name. I think if they just removed the E and called it Moleskin, it would be so much better. Or if they said it is 100% pronounced Moleskine because the E implies a hard I, you get the idea. I don't like that name because different people pronounce it differently. So if you show the name to 5 or 10 different people, do they all pronounce it the same, or are they unsure? And if they're unsure, it makes it harder for word of mouth. Like I said, a couple examples of this, and this is going to be in English speaking places that they're hard to pronounce, but Huawei is a huge electronics manufacturer, and I would have no idea how to pronounce that if I hadn't heard Tom Merritt say it on Daily Tech News Show often. We have Reuters, which I know these are big companies, but today I would not pick that name. This name that's on screen here that I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce. The fifth and final mistake that people make is pigeonholing themselves, being too specific with their names. So for example, if you have a job board for linemen, which is electricians, and you had apprenticelinemanjobs.com or linemanjobs.com versus something a little more brandable and generic like ampjobs.com, lineman jobs would have some obvious search traffic, but it really limits what you can expand into. It might be great for SEO, but it's going to cause you headaches later if you need to pivot. So consider a fictitious job board called remoteonlyjobs.com. Does that name unnecessarily pigeonhole your business? In terms of you maybe wanting to expand into non-remote jobs down the line, what if you need to pivot the business or expand the focus? And you might be thinking, yeah, but if I follow all the above, there's nothing left. But that's not true. As I said, start with a brand name, and I try to get the best name and then reverse engineer and figure out what's the best domain name I can get that works for this. So you can add a prefix like get or hey or use or let's, or you can add a suffix if you're an app like app. So I had drip. Couldn't afford drip.com, it was 6 figures, and I got getdrip.com. Now the downside is people used to call the product GetDrip. That was annoying. It was a 7-letter domain name that I paid $8 a year for. And so when you're first starting out, adding a prefix or a suffix, it's okay. It's not ideal, but it's okay. Another thing to think about is, can you add a category descriptor? Like on this YouTube channel, we often talk about a fictional CRM called Bump, and we went out and registered bumpcrm.com. In fact, I did this with TinySeed. The first domain name for TinySeed that I registered for $8 on GoDaddy was tinyseedfund.com, right? Because we're an accelerator and a venture fund. And then I went out and bought tinyseed.com because I wanted it and it was available for sale, but I secured that one for $8 first, so I had some negotiating leverage. In addition, especially if you're in the SaaS space, different top-level domains can work. .co, .ai, .io, even .ly, not as much anymore, but these are all acceptable, right? Think of customer.io that has built a $10,000,000 ARR SaaS, customer.io. Think of close.io. I think they actually bought the .com now, but I still call them close.io. One of the final things I'll wrap with is don't use 2 or more of these suffix workaround things. So like getbumpcrm.co, it's hot garbage, right? If you could get bump.co versus bumpcrm.com, and you could get either one for a decent price, I'd consider it. Like bump.co, bump.ai, bump.io, these are not bad domain names. In fact, one of the regrets I had with Drip was I registered getdrip.com. We built the company. People called it GetDrip. It was a success story in the end, but it always bothered me. And when the CEO of the company that was acquiring us started talking with us, he told me, he said, hey, I went and bought drip.co and drip.io while they were acquiring us. And he said, if the acquisition doesn't go through, I'll just sell them to you for what I bought them for, which was a few $1,000s. And I think back in the days when I started Drip, that felt like a lot of money. But by that time, I really should have bought these domains. They were not that hard to acquire. And I think it was, inexperience on my part in not buying them. So in a second, I'm going to tell you how one TinySeed founder decided on his domain name and thus his product name. But before I do that, as you know, I run MicroConf and TinySeed, and TinySeed is our startup accelerator for bootstrapped SaaS founders, and we run applications twice a year. We fund companies all around the world. We funded 151 companies to date, and applications for our next batch are opening soon. Head to tinyseed.com/apply to enter your email and be notified when they open, or if they're already open, go ahead and apply. It takes maybe 10 minutes. We ask questions to get you thinking about your business, and if in doubt, fill it out. Love to have a chat with you. I actually talked through this entire process with founder Derek Reimer of SavvyCal. This was in episode 614 of Startups for the Rest of Us, and he talked about setting a budget for a domain name. He dreamed up a ton of words that might be associated with a scheduling app, because that's what he had built. Cal was one of those words. There were some other he threw in. He dropped Cal into Lean Domain Generator, and then he started a short list of ones that could work. He reviewed the list based on some of the guidelines we outlined in this video today. And then he got feedback from a bunch of trusted friends. I was one of them. We were running through domains and I was saying, that's a good one, that's a hard one, blah, blah, blah. And SavvyCal became the winner. Ultimately, if your business is solving a problem that someone's willing to pay you for, a poor choice of a domain name isn't going to shut you down. So don't fall into the trap of analysis paralysis when it comes to naming your business. But be careful, because it's important to get it right the first time if you can. If you're looking for more info on naming your business, check out the book, Hello, My Name is Awesome, How to Create Brand Names That Stick. And Laura Roeder, who I mentioned earlier in this video, has great advice in an article called How I Nabbed the .com for My Bootstrap Startup Without Spending $1 million. And we'll have both of those linked up in the show notes. If you're choosing a business name, you might be in the early stages of starting your SaaS. There's a lot of mistakes that I see founders make in the early days, including building something that no one cares about. Check out this next video where I talk about that and 9 other mistakes you'll want to avoid. Make sure you like and subscribe for more content like this every week. It really does help us continue to grow the channel. Thanks for watching.